Ciao Mark, ci siamo visti a marzo e ora una seconda volta qui a Civitella Ranieri, sempre in Italia. Grazie per aver accettato questo secondo incontro.
Grazie a lei.
Grazie a te davvero. Cosa hai fatto in questi mesi?
L'ultima 3 mesi, I've been traveling. Well, I've taken a long vacation, and I've traveled to Spain, to Italy, to Switzerland, back to Italy, all by car. And I've not been writing, I've just been reading, and generally looking around. It hasn't been a time filled with work. It's been mainly just being on vacation.
Si sta bene in vacanza, eh?
Hey, it's always great.
Mark, che cos'è per te il tempo e qual è il rapporto tra il poeta e il tempo?
For you, what is time and what is the relationship between the poet and time?
One moment. In Italian, ripeto in Italian.
Okay.
Mark, che cos'è per te il tempo e qual è il rapporto tra il poeta e il tempo?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer. Time means different things to different poets, as time would mean a different thing to each individual. My feeling about time is we live in it, and we're sort of on loan to time. I don't know who lends us out, but time is, in other words, human time is just a part of time. It's the measurable part of time. Time exists as a huge, unfathomable, immeasurable entity around what we are able to conceive of. We live from moment to moment, hour to hour, month to month, year to year, and such notions of time seem very local and ultimately frail, the way we measure our lives. Beyond that, I don't think we can go. I mean, the universe is so vast, spatially and temporally, that we have no way of dealing with it. Oh, physicists can deal with it mathematically, but mathematics, for a person like me, doesn't have any reality, since I can't read that language. And I wonder to what extent it is real to the mathematician. If you look up into the night sky, for example, what you experience is a lot of small pinpoints of light in a black cloth. You don't experience the billions and billions of stars and the billions of light years that separates them. That's not part of our experience. It's beyond our capacity to experience. I mean, it could be that we are still too primitive to afford such experience. But, well, I think we are primitive in so many ways and limited in so many ways that, I mean, even my ability to talk about time in relation to my own life is so limited that at this moment, for instance, I feel very primitive. But maybe in the course of our discussion I can come back to time. I feel we're on loan. I feel that we've come from nothing and suddenly we are given a measurable length of time in which to live, and then we go back to nothing. surrounded by the endlessness of time and the endlessness of space, neither of which we are able to comprehend in the beginning nor in the end, so something like that.
Gliela fai in inglese?
When you were 4 years old, you moved from Canada to Philadelphia in the United States. What are your memories as a child of 4 years?
Il tuo tempo è iniziato nel 1934. Sei nato in Canada, tuo padre era un uomo d'affari, ha fatto molte cose e tua madre è stata in tempi diversi una maestra di scuola e un archeologo. Come li ricordi?
Well, when I moved to the United States, my father did have a job and my mother was not yet an archaeologist. But, and I didn't speak much English. I was 4.5 years old. I was persecuted, as people with foreign accents were generally in those days in the United States, especially children who are by nature conformists didn't want a foreigner in their midst. So I was persecuted. And one day a boy got in a fight with me and I came home weeping, and my father said, you know, you should retaliate, you should fight back. And so the next time I confronted this boy and threw him down the stairs at school. And my parents were visited by the principal and the teacher of my class, saying that they would have to exercise more control over me because I was violent, because I had hurt this kid by throwing him down the stairs. So that was my first manly act, and one of the last, because I'm generally a peaceful fellow. So my first experience in the United States was that of an outsider, and to a certain extent I've always felt like an outsider. On the other hand, my first experience in the United States, because I was such an outsider, made me want to conform all the more. So I learned English very quickly, and without a trace of an accent. For a while I had an accent. And I wanted to be like everybody else. And to a certain extent, I'm a mixture of somebody who behaves and sort of looks like everybody else. On the other hand, psychologically, I suppose, I feel like somewhat of an outsider. I feel like I don't really belong, and not only that, I don't want to belong. I don't want to be like everybody else. I don't want to speak like everybody else or think like anybody else. So I think that schism of the desire to conform and the desire to be apart was born when I came to the United States.
Avevi 4 anni.
4 years old. It's never too early to learn.
Ecco, quando avrai sicuramente un ricordo di quel bambino, no? Di 4 anni. Com'era?
You have to explain.
What's your first memory?
Oh, okay. Now I understand. My first memory I don't have many. There are several. One is I had I was a skinny kid, but I had dimples instead of knuckles. And I noticed there was a boy who lived down the street who had knuckles, and he was 7 years old. So I thought, when I'm 7 years old, I will have knuckles. My dimples, my child baby hands would disappear. That's one early memory. The other early memory is waiting for my grandparents to visit us in Philadelphia, and my mother dressing me up in very nice short pants, a shirt, and a clip-on tie that I wore. And I remember looking out the window waiting for them. Waiting. And then they showed up, and my grandfather gave me a present of some silver dollars. Maybe something was born at that moment. The desire for wealth, which produced a counter-desire, not to have any wealth. I'm usually split on so many issues. I'm only joking now. I mean, that's not the case. But those essentially are my earliest memories at that time. Waiting for my grandparents and wanting to have knuckles. Oh, one other thing. I remember playing in a sandbox with a little girl out in the back, and I scraped myself with a nail. And I went in the house crying. And my mother asked me, did I want a big bandage or a little bandage? And I said, a little one. And as I walked outside to the sandbox again, and the little girl there, I realized I made a mistake. That the big bandage would have been better because it would have justified my crying and made the wound seem more important. See, the little bandage diminished the drum of the episode. I learned a lesson.
A Filadelfia, scusa, la dico in italiano, vedo se comprende o vuoi dirla in inglese. Quella a Filadelfia, hai frequentato la scuola pubblica?
In Philadelphia you went to public school. Abbiamo già, insomma...
Sì, lo so che sì, volevo semplicemente che lui mi dicesse se era vero che avesse questo accento francese.
Già parlavo di
Ok. Allora vai a quella successiva, poco dopo.
Okay. Your father, who worked for Pepsi Cola, moved many times to Cuba, Colombia, Peru, then Mexico, and you obviously went with your family. These movings around, were they fun for you? Was it hard? Did you miss having friends in one place? And is there one place specifically that you've brought with you your entire life? One specific location?
Yeah.
Poco dopo tuo padre, ripeto, poco dopo tuo padre, che lavorava per la Pepsi Cola, no? Si trasferisce con la famiglia a Cuba, e poi in Colombia, in Perù, in Messico, tanti spostamenti assieme alla tua famiglia. Ecco, era divertente per te, forse però il viaggiare ti impediva di avere degli amici, di fissare un ricordo. Allora, Mark, dimmi se c'è un paesaggio, un luogo che hai portato con te per sempre.
Well, first of all, my father joined Pepsi Cola when I was 14 years old. There's a huge gap between 4 years old and 14. My father, in those 10 years, had many different kinds of jobs. But when he worked for Pepsi Cola and took us with him, and living in those countries, it wasn't exactly pleasant because I missed my friends in the States. And first of all, living in Cuba, I was only there in the summer. And then in Barranquilla, Colombia, I was there for 7 months, but I went to private school in the States. And then in Lima, Peru, it was in the summers. But I learned a lot. I mean, I saw the way different people lived. My mother, by that time, had become an archaeologist by the time we were in Peru and later in Mexico. So I would go with her on digs and have lots of things that I would have no access to explain to me. So those travels were educational and rather dramatic. But the one significant thing in Barranquilla, Colombia, where I was for a long time, was 7 months, my parents, I had a lot of time on my hands. I was bored. And it's when I began reading a lot to fill up the time. I wasn't much of a reader before that. My parents said, why don't you write to your friends in the States? Tell them what you're doing, what you're reading, what you're looking at. So it's the first experience I had as a writer. Because what I did was, as the minute, I remember the first letter I wrote, I wanted them to envy me, and I wanted to write in such a way that they would wish they were having the experiences I was. And that, so I had to shape sentences in a particular way to carry this, to describe not only what I was doing, but make them feel a certain way about what I was doing. And I think at that moment, I became a writer, although subsequently that instinct disappeared for a while. It resurfaced later on when I was 24 or so. But I think that there were two things, that moment when I wrote the letter and had to shape it in such a way to make my friends envious. Also, I spent a lot of time in bed as a child because I was sick quite a lot. And you know, I had pneumonia 4 times as a child. This is before our travels in South America. And it was before penicillin, and I was allergic to sulfa drugs. So it meant 6 weeks, 2 months in bed, with a terrible cough. And I had a lot of time to daydream. And I think that, and not able to see my friends or anything, I think that made me a professional daydreamer. And that became the basis for my ability to fantasize as an adult later. I mean, this is after the fact. I'm not quite sure that this is the case, but it seems, if we're looking for cause and effect, it seems like a fairly rational way of approaching it.
Eri un bambino che disegnava, che dipingeva,
Sì.
E portavi con te questi ricordi dipingendo?
Well, I always drew as a child, and I wasn't much of a reader, and until I was a teenager, I never thought about writing. And drawing was something that I did fairly well. My mother, who had studied art, encouraged me greatly to draw and to paint. And I always thought that I would be a painter until I went to art school, and I discovered a lot of other people's mothers told them that they could be painters, and they were better painters than I was.
Ok, studiavi pittura.
You studied painting when you became a reader of Wallace Stevens. What did Stevens teach you?
Studiavi pittura quando diventasti improvvisamente un fervente lettore di Stevens, uno dei maggiori poeti degli Stati Uniti del XX secolo. Che cosa ti insegnò Stevens?
Well, that's very difficult to say. I think the value of the individual word, or the power of the individual word, was certainly a lesson I learned from Stevens, because his language is extraordinary, and one does pay attention to his words. You read Stevens' poems, amazed at his vocabulary. And also his music and his image making. By image making, I mean just the visual character of his poems. If you're a painter, I think you're very susceptible to poems that have pictorial riches, or pictorial character, or pictorial power. Stevens, of all the poets of the 20th century, I think, is the greatest pictorialist. Also, there's an element of the exotic in Stevens. He's so exotic that you're under you have no doubts that what you're reading is poetry. The other thing about Stevens is, and this is probably the most interesting thing, is that I liked him without really understanding him at first. And I realized that one could love a poem without really knowing what it meant. That the experience of a poem was not necessarily the knowledge of a poem. That one could absorb a poem without being able to say what it was about. I learned that from Stevens.
Mm-hmm.
For Stevens, the poet is one who asks and writes the questions of life. What is the question of life that Mark Strand, as a poet, writes?
Per Stevens, poeta è colui che scrive e sostiene la domanda della vita. Qual è la domanda della vita che scrive e sostiene Mark Strand?
Well, I don't know, to tell you the truth. I mean, I know what I ask of life, which is just one more day, another month, another year, another vacation, another meal, more. What I ask of, what my writing asks of life, I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to know. If I knew, I might not write. I think what keeps me writing is the fact that I don't know what I'm writing about or why I'm writing. To ask that kind of question is for readers, not for the writer, at least not for me.
In 1960, you were 26 years old, and you had a Fulbright scholarship in Italy, in Florence. What did you, when leaving Florence, what did you bring with you that was new in your ticket?
Well,
Aspetta.
no.
Avevi 26 anni nel 1960 quando ti fu data una borsa di studio per cui venisti in Italia, a Firenze, per studiare la poesia italiana del XIX secolo. Cosa c'era di nuovo nella tua valigia quando ripartisti dall'Italia?
Well, the experience in Italy was a fantastic one. For one thing, I saw a lot of paintings that I'd only seen in reproduction, and seeing them in actuality was a revelation. And also, my Italian was a good deal better than it is now. In fact, my Italian is gone. And so I was able to read Leopardi, and able to read Montale and Quasimodo and Ungaretti and Palazzeschi, and slowly, I mean, but I read them, and I had I left with a scant knowledge of Italian poetry, a little Foscolo and Carducci too, but I really focused on my own writing when I was in Italy, and I'm not sure what the influence of reading those Italian poets was on my own writing. I have a feeling because the language is so different, probably not so great. But it was my first time in Europe, my first time in this mythical Italy of the Renaissance and the Risorgimento. It was fantastic, and I grew up a lot during that year. The year was a lonely one because I was virtually cut off, but productive. It was the year in which I became published for the first time by, a leading magazine in the United States. And that sort of thing.
Tu ti ricordi il bagage, no? La valigia che avevi? Cosa c'era
Sì,
dentro?
sì, sì.
Cosa c'era dentro?
Di vero?
Mhm.
Ropa,
Roba,
just clothes.
cose, shows, cose,
Cosa?
scarpe,
Sca-
shoes,
Solo un paio di scarpe, qualche camice, pantalone,
rasoio.
sì, non molto, no, muy poco.
Poco,
As I'm speaking Spanish now.
yes.
Very little. I had a typewriter, a manual typewriter that I carried, but not in the suitcase. Outside, I had shoes. Well, I wore my only pair of shoes. Clothes meant nothing to me.
E negli occhi che cosa c'era?
In my eyes,
Cosa portavi negli occhi?
I'm not sure I understand. What did I take that I saw, do you think?
What were in your eyes?
What were in my eyes? Nothing, just my eyes. I didn't wear glasses then. I was without glasses. I did feel, there is one thing I felt when I was here. I felt very American. I loved Italy, but I felt so different. And Italy was a different place then than it is now. There were fewer cars. The taxis were black and green. A lot of people rode bicycles. And the ruins of the Second World War were visible everywhere. And I bought a second-hand Lambretta, which I drove around. And I don't know, that's it. I learned to drink good coffee here.
Good. Good coffee.
Very good. I lived on 350 lira a day. 350 cents a day. I would have a huge lunch. Risotto, and some meat, insalata, for 350 euros.
Cucina buona.
After this experience in Italy, you began to publish the first poetry. In 1964, you came out with the book "Sleeping with One Eye Open." You taught English in the United States. In those years, you were 30. They were the years that the United States was in Vietnam. Why did you choose the title "Sleeping with One Eye Open"?
Well,
Fu dopo quell'esperienza in Italia, a Firenze, che iniziasti a pubblicare le tue prime poesie, no? Era il 64 quando uscì il tuo primo libro, Dormendo con un occhio aperto. Insegnavi inglese, avevi 30 anni, erano gli anni in cui gli Stati Uniti erano in guerra con il Vietnam. Perché scegliesti questo titolo, Dormendo con un occhio aperto?
well, the war was just beginning in 1964, 65, and I was very opposed to the war and wrote poems against the war, as most poets did. I think most poets were against the war, if memory serves me. But they were bad poems. And so, with the exception of one poem, The Way It Is, I threw all those poems away. But I would read them at these big read-ins. Poets would read to an audience of the convinced, people who also believe we shouldn't be engaged in the war. And but that was actually later. That was in the late 60s when the urgency of getting out of the war was, very palpable, and people were very upset that we were there. But the title, Sleeping with One Eye Open, suggests an allegiance to the world of dreams and to the world of actuality. that I had my eyes were, one eye was focused inward, the other outward. And to a certain extent, this is the obligation of the poet, to keep the inward vision and the outward vision in balance. And so I think that title indicates what would be a lifelong modus operandi. But that's all. I wouldn't go beyond that. I mean, does that make sense to you? Okay.
In the 60s, you were friends with Richard Howard, Charles Simic, and Charles Wright. What did you talk about with them?
Una volta in un'intervista hai detto che devi la tua carriera di poeta a un altro poeta, Henry Ford. Che cosa fece per te?
Well,
Sorry.
Scusa, non era questa la domanda?
No.
Ok.
Once someone who was interviewing said that thanks to Harry Ford you became a poet. What did he do for you?
One moment. Una volta in un'intervista tu hai detto che devi la tua carriera di poeta a un altro poeta, Henry Ford. Che cosa fece per te Henry Ford?
well, first of all, what I talked about with Richard Howard was we would meet 3 times a week for lunch and talk about the books we'd read. So my relationship with Richard Howard was strictly literary, and you know, sometimes we would show each other poems, but not with the frequency that I would share poems with other poets. Richard was very advanced. He was way ahead of me as a poet. But my 2 closest friends, Charles Wright and Charles Simic, we would talk about poetry by and large, jobs, wine, food, especially with Simic, who likes to eat and drink. Charlie and I would talk about foreign poets a lot, and this culminated in a book we did together later on called Another Republic. Harry Ford was not a poet, he was an editor, and he did save my life, figuratively speaking, as a poet, because in 1965 or 66, when I came back from Brazil, I applied for a grant called the Ingram Merrill Grant. Now you can, but Harry Ford was on the board of the grant. He was also the editor at Athenaeum. And he wrote me a letter saying, I loved your manuscript, but we're not going to, I can't take it for Athenaeum because we're going to give you an Ingram Merrill grant and we can't do both. And I'm sure you'd rather have the money than the publication because somebody else is certainly going to publish your book. Well, 2 years went by and nobody published my book. Nobody wanted it. I mean, my poems were coming out in magazines, but book publication seemed impossible. So by chance, I met Harry Ford at a party in New York. He said, where's your book? What happened? I said, well, nobody wants it. Well, why don't you send it to me? Let me look at it. I sent it to him, and 2 days later, he called me on the telephone and said, we're going to do your book. Even though I gave you an Ingram Merrill grant, we're going to do your book, and we'll do it right away like that. So in a sense, book publication was taken care of. I mean, and Harry Ford remained my editor until he died.
Un altro poeta che ha giocato un ruolo fondamentale nella tua vita è stato Joseph Brodsky, che tu hai conosciuto negli anni 70. Ecco, ci racconti il tipo di relazione che avresti con Brodsky?
Well, I met him in 72 when he came to the United States. And I had admired him because he'd been translated into English. And I had sent him cards, Christmas cards or New Year's cards. And when he came to the United States, I asked him, had he received any of my cards? He said, yes. And he said, not only that, but I've read your poems. And he quoted a long poem of mine to me in English. You know, I mean, I didn't even know the poem. Joseph had a fantastic memory. He could recite for hours. But as I listened to him recite my poem, I was overwhelmed. I wanted to fall down on my knees and kiss his shoes. But we remained very good friends, and Joseph's influence on me was much greater than my influence on him. Joseph would ask me questions about usage. What sounded better, what was more natural, would this word do or would another word be better? And I would ask Joseph questions, which he would answer, and his answers were always very astute. And invariably I would use what he told me. I'm not sure that he used what I told him. Now, another aspect of my relationship with Joseph, it was largely a worshipful one. I really worshiped him. He was the smartest person I'd ever encountered. He was so quick, and so his imagination was so fertile. He could develop what ideas or hypotheses quicker than anyone I'd ever encountered. He was, his intellectual energy was overwhelming. And it was a lot of fun to be with someone who was so intellectually alive. I must say, when I was with him, I would get very excited and feel like writing. And that's, you can't duplicate that. And when he was out of the country, we would talk on the phone, and it was the same thing. It was a very charged, poetic, intellectual exchange, largely on his, more emphatically on his part than on my part.
Someone once said that at a certain point your poetry became autobiographical. Can you talk about that, referencing Darker of 1970 and The Story of Our Lives from 1973? What changed in your writing?
Qualcuno ha scritto che a un certo punto la tua scrittura si è fatta autobiografica, anzi obliquamente autobiografica, come se sarebbe avvenuto in Buio, più buio, questo poema del 70. Poi via via questo io che si sentiva molto minacciato dall'esterno approda a un io più interiore. Accade forse, questo lo dice la critica, nella poesia tua più famosa, la denarrazione. Si tratta di una poesia lunga. Che cosa ha cambiato nella tua scrittura?
Well, first of all, I think Darker is not so autobiographical. I think The Story of Our Lives, of course, is the title which suggests as much. I think that in American poetry there was a shift to the autobiographical because of all the confessional poets at that time, and I didn't want to be left out. This is the part of me that is a conformist. I wanted to belong to what I thought of as the main thrust of American poetry. But it didn't last long. I mean, by the time my selected poems came out and I wrote those Nova Scotia poems, I thought I'd had enough. And I'd had enough with confessional poetry, reading it in the works of others, and I decided that this was not my strength, that I was not a very good autobiographical poet, and that I should turn my attention elsewhere. I don't think that my autobiographical poems are my strongest poems. I mean, they're interesting, and oddly enough, they're not posed as autobiographical. They're fictional. I mean, they're posed as fictions. The story of our lives is also a story, a fiction. It could be the story of another life. But as it happens, it represents my life at that time. And frankly, I became not simply disenchanted with my work at that time, but a little repelled by it. I just didn't want to go there. I didn't want to talk about my life. I thought my strength was more in the realm of irony, fantasy, making things up, creating alternate lives, not the one I had. Why should I write about the life I had when I could make up so many more interesting lives? There's nothing that interesting about my life that merits revisiting it endlessly in my poems. So I put it aside.
In 1978, you got a lot of international fame publishing The Late Hour. You went to teach at some of the most important American universities, and in 1978 as well, your poetry, speaking of irony, became much more ironic. Can you talk about that irony that before wasn't apparent to you?
Nel 78 diventi poi un poema, nel 78 diventi poi un poeta di fama internazionale pubblicando L'ora tarda, vai a insegnare nelle più importanti università americane e tiri fuori anche un io ironico che fino a quel momento non era ancora apparso nella tua poesia. Ecco, ci parli di questo cambiamento nella tua poesia?
Well, it didn't happen in 1978. In fact, 78 to 80 was the end of the autobiographical poetry, and then I didn't write for 5 years because I didn't know what to say. It's easy to say that I should turn to to fantasy or irony and all of that, but nothing was happening. And I began writing magazine articles. I wrote a couple of art books, children's books. I wrote a book of short stories. And then what really happened, what turned me around and put me on the course of my later books, The Continuous Life, Dark Harbor, etc., was reading Robert Fitzgerald's translation of the Aeneid. That did it. It set off a kind of internal explosion. I just suddenly, my language changed, it became richer, the sentences became more elaborate and longer, the poems, I think, became more interesting. They were certainly not autobiographical, and I was having a great deal of fun writing them. And I owe it all to Robert Fitzgerald and especially to Virgil and the Aeneid. I think that's what did it. The response to my poetry, I don't know, because I don't read reviews, so I don't know what it was. I always assume that the response to my poems is positive.
Abbiamo un po' parlato anche di queste qua.
Del monument?
Vabbè, come un po' per un periodo ho smesso di scrivere.
Va bene, non importa.
Da dove?
Dal monumento.
Okay. In 1979, you abandoned writing poetry and you wrote The Monument. And at a conference you were
Tu hai scritto poi il monumento rispondendo a una domanda che ti era stata posta in una conferenza. Come ti piacerebbe essere tradotto tra 500 anni? E tu hai risposto scrivendo quest'opera, The Monument.
Well, actually, the monument was a reaction against the autobiographical poems I was talking about. It's really about how I wish to be. I mean, it's a rather grandiose gesture to sort of address one's translator in the future as if I would have a translator in the future, which is doubtful, and how I wish to be read in the future, that, especially 500 years in the future, that's rather comic, I mean, in its grandiosity. But the idea of the whole notion of how one is, not simply how one's work is translated, but how one is translated. How does one's work reveal who one is? You know, and to what extent is the translator the poet? Especially in the future when the poet is no longer there to speak for himself, and only the poems are there to speak for him. And the book also expresses a disenchantment with this mode of sort of provisional immortality. Mm-hmm. Because what one really wants is to live forever, not necessarily through, well, certainly not through one's work, but in one's person. To be alive, say to be 25 for 1,000 years. I mean, that's impossible and ridiculous, but in some very profound way, this is what we wish for. And we may not acknowledge it, but it's there. I'm not sure any of this is revealed in the monument. The monument is actually a very playful book, which I thought would be amusing to read. I mean, because it's a consideration of the various ways in which we're transported into the future, if you're a writer. Simply that.
Ma secondo te la morte può essere ingannata?
No. No. Mai. No. Death is absolute. Mm-hmm. I think when we spoke earlier a few months ago, it was clear that one could inhabit the immortality room, but even there one's time is limited. I mean, there are several deaths. There's the actual death, we die. Then there's a second death, when nobody remembers us, when none of our relations remember us, and our grandchildren never think of us, and our great-grandchildren lose track of who their ancestors were. This is the slower second death. The third death, if you're a writer, is your works are taken out of the library because there's no room for them anymore, and they're buried, and you're forgotten, and no one has any recourse to anything you've ever done. This is the third death. It's inevitable. And it's not a bad thing. I mean, I think one must live with the idea that whatever we do and whoever we are, we can be replaced. And it can be replaced by others.
There was a period of time where you stopped writing poetry. How long did this period last? You spoke a little bit about this before, but you dedicated yourself to children's books, journalism, art critique, stories. Why did you stop writing poetry? Did you not believe in it anymore?
Poi a un certo punto hai hai mollato la poesia e ti sei messo a fare altro, critico, giornalista, come se avessi voluto prendere le distanze, no, dalla poesia. Come mai è accaduto questo?
Well, I mean, I had no ideas. I simply stopped writing because I didn't want to write. I didn't want to write bad poems. And once you stop writing for a little while, you seem to step out of the world of poetry, or the mindset out of which poetry is produced. It doesn't mean that you don't miss it, but it's not part of your life the way it is when you're writing. And it was just 5 years in which I didn't write poetry. It's not a tragedy. It was actually necessary, I think. I think every writer has to spend some time recharging his batteries. You know, you can't keep expending energy, book after book after book. I mean, some people are able to. I just don't have that makeup.
Tell us a little bit about when you became Poet Laureate in 1990. What did that mean to you as a poet, and what happened to Mark Strand?
Poi ritorni a scrivere di nuovo poesia e pubblichi La vita ininterrotta, con il quale ottieni il titolo di poeta laureato degli Stati Uniti, e la tua opera poetica acquista una visibilità senza precedenti. Ecco, cosa vuol dire poeta laureato, Mark?
Well, being poet laureate didn't mean that much to me. It was a title. I was a little surprised that, because the previous poets laureate had been much older, and I was still in my early 50s, and so I was a little surprised, and it actually didn't make much difference. I gave a lot of readings. I sold more books than I might have otherwise. I did not write a single poem that year because I lived in a house that was a terrible house in Washington. We rented it, and it was, it was a year of socializing, going to parties, cocktail parties, dinner parties. Because if you have a title in Washington, then you are somebody. If you don't have a title, you're nobody. So if you're poet laureate, it's like window dressing at a party. It's like a little bouquet you put on a table, I was kind of something a little frivolous to have at a party, something like that.
In 1999, you won the Pulitzer Prize for Literature. What do you remember about the day that you had this news?
Porto Oscuro esce nel 93 ed è un singolo poema diviso in 45 sezioni. Poi con Tormenta al singolare, Mark Strand nel 1999 si aggiudica il premio Pulitzer per la letteratura, consacrato ancora una volta poeta. Che ricordi di quel giorno?
Well, I remember the day very well, as one would. My editor, Harry Ford, had died a month before, and I was in New York, as it happened, and I was sitting in Harry Ford's office at Knopf, my publisher, because later in the afternoon I had to deliver a eulogy for Harry Ford. And I was using his typewriter to type the eulogy on. And I left. Suddenly I felt I had to get out and take a walk. And I went to Saks Fifth Avenue, big store, and I bought a white shirt, and quite unconsciously. I bought the white shirt, and I came back to Knopf to finish the eulogy, And I realized Harry Ford always wore white shirts. And I had quite unconsciously paid homage to Harry Ford by buying a white shirt. And when I got to the offices at Knopf, everybody came up to me and said, "Congratulations, Sonny Maida, the boss, congratulations. You won the Pulitzer Prize." Whoa, great. And I went into Harry's office and finished typing the eulogy. And so I remember that day, the white shirt, the typing of the eulogy, and getting the news from people at Knopf.
Beh, interessante.
You've published 11 books of poetry, you've written prose, you've done translations, you've written about art, children's books, journalism, all of these different things that we've talked about. You have a wide profile of work. What are you working on now?
A cosa stai lavorando adesso?
I'm writing my masterpiece. No, I'm kidding. I've been writing, I came to Civitella last year in May, and I began writing short little prose pieces. And I finished the book in February, which is 9 months or 8 months. I've never written a book. Well, I've written, Dark Harbor was a book I wrote even more quickly. But I wrote it, and it's being published in Italy. I mean, it's being published in the States, but it'll be published here by Notte Tempo.
Ginevra Bompiani.
Yes, next year.
Yes.
And I loved writing them. It was so much fun. It was such a relief from writing poetry. Poetry began to exercise so much pressure on me. I felt I had to be better than I could possibly be. And I began to feel my poems weren't good enough. And it created a kind of unhappiness and anxiety in me, so that I turned to writing these short prose pieces, which I write once or twice, and that's it. And they seem to represent, not that this is important, but who I am much more emphatically than my poems. Some of them are funny, some of them are, I mean, even to the extent that they sound like jokes. Some are more serious, some even sound like poems, although they're not. I don't consider them poems. Other people consider them poems. So I stopped. I finished in February, and I decided enough of the prose pieces. I was going to finish up a memoir that I had begun, but then I went back to making collages, and then I made 4 or 5. Then I made 4 more, and 4 more, and I showed them to a few people. Now a couple are in a show at a gallery in New York, works on paper, and I'm going to keep doing them. But coming to Civitella, where I started the prose pieces, yesterday I sat down and wrote another prose piece. It's too late to go in my book. But, you know, when I was in Milan, I spoke with Antonio Riccardi, the head of Mondadori, who was a little upset that I'd given the prose pieces to another publisher. I said, but you know, it's a small book, and my editor thought you would probably be too busy, and Mondadori had just come out with this big book of mine.
Big.
So, but I tell you what, I'll write more. I was just joking. I'll write more, and when I get to 100, you can do the whole thing. And I had really I was just being polite. I had no intention of writing more. But when I got here, suddenly this place, I wrote this prose piece, and I got an idea for another, and who knows? In another year, I may have a book for Antonio, you know. So.
This is a good lead into the next question, where it's a question about place, luogo, posto. Now we find each other at Civitella, a very calm place, a relaxing
Ora sei in un posto tranquillo, Civitella Ranieri, riesci a scrivere però facilmente perché qui c'è silenzio, c'è quiete. Hai tutto quello che serve per poter scrivere, no? Il silenzio. Ma tu riesci anche a scrivere in metropolitana oppure in un luogo pubblico? Oppure ti sentiresti troppo osservato ed emotivamente, diciamo, scoperto per poterlo fare, per poter scrivere in un luogo pubblico?
Well, I think I need quiet. You're absolutely right. Silence is a very important factor. It would be impossible for me to write in the subway, although I read in the subway. It would be impossible. It's impossible for me to write poetry anywhere but in a very quiet place. I can write lectures or, you know, other things maybe in an airplane, although I don't want the person next to me to see me writing because I don't want him to be curious about what I'm doing. I'd rather be reading. I don't want to have any interaction with the person I'm sitting next to. But and also there's a fear of being perceived as, you know, over-emotional. You know, I think writing in a public place is a little showy. I'm always surprised at people who go to Starbucks and write, you know, or go to cafes and write, announcing to the world that they're writers. I'd rather keep it a secret and private matter, at least while I'm writing. After I'm done, it's, of course, what I do belongs out there to the world.
Why does one write poetry? Why does one read poetry? What does the poet see in the world that we cannot see?
Mark, perché si scrive poesia e perché si legge la poesia? Per scoprire che il poeta, quello che abbiamo scelto di leggere, vede il mondo come lo vediamo noi?
I think the only difference between a poet and other people is the poet writes poems. And a poet has access to the history of poetry, to poems that have been written before he came along, so that he has a sense of what the possibilities for a poem are, and has a familiarity with the ways other writers have registered their experience in the world. It doesn't mean that a poet's experiences are deeper or richer than other people's. Other people have feelings. Other people fall in love. Other people, are afraid of the night. Other people don't want to go to war. It's just that a poet, writes about how he feels, but not other people will sometimes write a poem here and there, but a poet has learned the language of poetry. A poet has his own language, and then he has a language that he has received. And there is also the language in which he's writing. There are three factors. There's the sensibility of the poet, there's the history of the poet, and there's the language in which the poet must transmit his feelings so that other people can recognize in themselves what the poet is saying.
Il poeta che tipo di realtà vuole trasferire al lettore?
That's a very difficult question. Well, I think it's different with different poets. I think it's an individual. It's not even a choice. A poet does what he can. Clearly, the one part of the answer is what the reality that the poet wishes to convey is the way he sees the world. But it's not merely the way he sees the world. it's the way he doesn't see the world, what is beyond what he's able to see. The poet, of course, in his poems presents a world that is recognizable to others, but he also presents a world which is embedded within him, a world which he has made his own, the world of his inner life, the world of his subjectivity, and which is largely made of feeling and ideas. So feelings and ideas are generated from within, and the decor of the poem is donated from without. And I guess the mixture of the inner and the outer, that thin line where inner and outer meet, is what the poet, is the reality that the poet presents to the reader, if that makes sense.
Yes. Sometimes often when reading your poetry, there's a strange voice, something unexpected that we're not able to completely grasp. Can you tell us about how the connection between what the poet means to say and what he ends up saying? Is a lot of what the poet says unconscious? Can he say many things that he doesn't know he's saying? And how do we interpret this?
Quando ascoltiamo la tua poesia veniamo affascinati dalla voce, dal ritmo e poi veniamo condotti nel mondo della poesia che hai scritto. A volte però nella poesia che hai scritto accade qualcosa di inimmaginabile o comunque ci si trova dinanzi a qualcosa di strano, di inaspettato, quasi che la lingua della poesia prenda il sopravvento su quello che il poeta ha detto o avrebbe voluto dire. Perché succede questo?
Well, another difficult question to answer. I think the poet is always reaching for something beyond the immediately apprehendable, beyond what it is possible to say. So what the poet tries to do is suggest more than what he's actually said. And so in other words, he hopes his poems have a degree of resonance and suggests the possibility of greater meaning than in fact the individual words possess, even possess with each other. This is the mystical part of poetry that is very hard to talk about in concrete terms. A lot of what the poet has to say is suggested unconsciously. And there's a world within each of us that we do not know, that we do not understand, and do not always have access to. And it appears in dreams, and very often it will appear in a poet's poems, quite unexpectedly. If poems were written strictly out of our consciousness, they would never be smarter than we are. They would be known instantaneously. Poems would carry on something like a rational discussion, where meaning would be apprehended immediately. But poetry tries to do something else. It tries not only to convey concrete meaning, but to suggest meaning beyond the concrete. And not merely meaning, but what it feels like to mean something. What it feels like to have something mean something to you. Poetry provides the experience of an experience. It's a very difficult thing to answer. I mean, I'm sort of beating around the bush or fumbling a little here, but that's probably as close as I could come right now.
experience of total immersion in the mystery of the being. Can you tell us, where does the language of poetry come from, the known or the unknown?
La poesia è una esperienza di totale immersione nel mistero dell'essere e del tempo. Da dove viene la lingua della poesia? Proviene dall'inconscio o dalla coscienza?
Well, I think it comes from both. I mean, one is born into a culture and into a language. The language is public property. Everybody, it belongs to everybody. On the other hand, to make it one's own, one has to absorb it in particular ways. One of the things a poet does is as I said in my last answer, is to invest it with something beyond the connotative, beyond the denotative, something more mysterious, something well, I think he has to invest the language with a degree of mystery. And how one does that, I have no idea, because society is opposed to mystery. Society uses language to convince you of the value of this drink or that drink, this soap or that soap, this article of clothing or that article of clothing. Society doesn't have time for ambiguity, nor does business have time for ambiguity. But we live lives that are largely ambiguous. We live lives that are not dependent on the absolutely rational or very clear decisions. We live lives that are somehow suspended between the two. And I think part of what poets do, what poets are responsive to, is that in-betweenness in which we live. That state of sometimes uncertainty, sometimes ambiguity, sometimes mystery, lack of clarity, that world, something like that.
You once said that poetry exists as something different in the universe, something the reader has never met before. What does the reader have to look for, to seek in a poem?
Una volta hai detto che una poesia esiste come qualcosa di diverso nell'universo, come qualcosa che il lettore non ha ancora incontrato prima di quel momento. Che cosa deve cercare questo lettore nella poesia?
Well, when I say a poem is something different in the world, I mean that each individual poem has its own identity, and it's a new thing. The poet begins with a blank sheet of paper and writes something on it, something that is never written before. The meaning of what has been written by this poet may exist elsewhere, but the particular way in which it has appeared on this piece of paper has not appeared before. So in that sense, each poem is something that exists anew, that has not had a pre-existence in the world, that comes as a brand new artifact. I don't think poets should strive for this. I think it simply happens. As a poet finds his own identity and his own voice, it simply happens. And we read a poet's poems because we hear that voice in the poems. You hear the voice of Leopardi when you read Leopardi, and by voice I don't mean the sound of the voice, I mean the identifying factors of the poem. what sets him apart from others, or what sets Montale apart from others, or Robert Frost, or Wallace Stevens.
Il lettore però non può leggere la poesia come se leggesse un newspaper, no? Un quotidiano.
No, impossible. You read a poem, the news in the newspaper is always different and always the same. You read it quickly, you read it in blocks, you don't read word by word. You know, newspaper writing is formulaic. There's nothing formulaic about the writing of a poem or the reading of a poem. You don't read a poem for news of the world. You don't read a poem to find out how hot it is today. It's not that kind of news that a poem delivers. The poem delivers
Meditation.
well, I mean, poem, yeah, one is more meditative reading a poem, but the news that poems deliver is, the news has to do with the states of the soul, the condition of your inner life. People read poems to find out what it is they really feel, how to put into words what it is that they're feeling. That's why people read poems at funerals or when they experience a tragic loss of one sort or another. They want to understand what it is that they're feeling, and they don't have the language for it, and a poem will provide them with the language. How do you account for and how do you describe the passage of time? The series of losses that account for that. Poems will allow you to experience that. The newspapers don't. The newspapers are responsible to what happened at the last moment, up to the moment. The poem tells you what has always been true of human beings.
Does the reader have to prepare a psychological space in his mind to read poems? And how could he free this space?
Tu credi che il lettore debba predisporre uno spazio psichico per leggere le poesie e come fare a liberare questo spazio della mente?
Well, I think, you do have to create a psychic space for each individual poet. I think you need quiet. I think you have to sequester yourself. I mean, go to a room, turn on the light, sit in a chair, open the book, read the poem over to yourself, maybe out loud. I think that the poem provides a rhythm, a cadence that seduces you into belief. And once you're seduced into belief, you begin to you continue. And that, if it's a powerful poem, will shut out the rest of the world.
Holderlin, writing on aesthetics, talked about three different kinds of poets: the lyric, the epic, and the tragic, and that each would do well to read within the other because in each one exists the other. Which are you, the lyric, the epic, or the tragic?
Holderlin, negli suoi scritti di estetica, dice: il poeta tragico fa bene a leggere e a studiare il poeta lirico, quello lirico l'epico il tragico, poiché nel tragico sta il compimento dell'epico, nel lirico il compimento del tragico, nell'epico il compimento del lirico. Infatti, dice Holderlin, sebbene il compimento di ognuno sia un'espressione mista di tutti e tre, soltanto uno dei tre generi è in ognuno di essi il più accentuato. Quale di questi tre generi, l'epico, il lirico e il tragico, appartiene alla tua poesia oppure è più accentuato nella tua poesia?
Well, it's clear that I'm a lyric poet, And it's clear that all poetry written today is lyric poetry. Nobody writes epics anymore. The epic has been taken over by the novel. And the tragic, there is an element of tragedy in a lot of lyric poetry. I think that the elegiac quality of lyric poetry contains an element of the tragic. Because tragedy has to do with loss, and to a certain extent, and well, to a great extent, lyric poetry does too. But tragedy exists on a much grander scale than lyric poetry. Lyric poetry is one human being's response to the world. A lyric poet speaks for himself. A tragic poet may speak for the condition of mankind, as the epic poet does. But the lyric poet's proposal is a much more modest one. Because it's the only one that can be believed now. The lyric poet's obligation is that of one person speaking to another. And there's nothing epic about that.
In our day and age, the media, television, the internet, boredom in general, with a society that's not as meditative as it might have been in the past, what can poetry offer this contemporary society?
Che cosa ha a che fare la poesia con le persone che invece vogliono guardare la televisione, divertirsi, navigare in rete, su internet? La nostra è un'epoca che credo abbia davvero poco di meditativo. La gente non legge tanto la poesia perché non vuole incontrare quel misterioso, quello strano di cui parlavamo. Perché allora uno oggi scrive le poesie?
Well, I think what we have to do as a society is reinvest in our inner lives. Everything in our world takes us out of ourselves. We go to the movies to be entertained, and all the work is done out there. We're asked to identify with others. Even in fiction, we identify with this character or that character. The action is external. The action in a poem is internal. And if we're going to save ourselves, I think we have to begin to look inward to see who we are. Because looking outward hasn't helped very much. To see poetry allows us to see our humanity from the inside out rather than from the outside in. And I think this is the obligation of poetry in this world of ours today.
I know that you think that the major responsibility for a poet is the language of poetry. How can you recognize a good poem from a bad poem?
So che pensi che allora abbiamo detto che la cosa più importante per un poeta è la lingua della poesia. Ecco, come si fa allora a riconoscere una buona poesia da una cattiva poesia?
Practice. I think after years and years of reading poetry, you begin to, the way you recognize bad writing from good writing, I don't have a set of principles. I just sense that this poet didn't know what he or she was talking about, or that this could have been said better, or it doesn't what's most dangerous is when I say to myself, this doesn't conform to any idea of poetry as I know it. And that's where I become a suspect in my judgment, because there's the possibility that someone has written something entirely new and entirely different that I am not prepared for, that nothing in my past has prepared me for. And so I may be missing something, and making a terrible mistake by rejecting that. My taste or my judgment is not infallible, but so the answer to your question is, I'm not sure I can tell the difference.
In the majority of your poetry, there is a certain mystery, an unknown, or death or loss. What is behind this truth?
La maggior parte delle tue poesie hanno a che fare con l'ignoto, con la morte, con la perdita. Che cosa c'è dietro questa verità?
Well, I mean, this is the conversation that goes full circle. We began talking about time. And since we exist in time, we experience loss. It's not only the loss of moments, but it's the loss of experience. It's as you move forward in time, you lose what was behind you. And, you know, as we get older, we lose our younger selves. We lose our parents. Sometimes as we get much older, we lose our friends. If we move from one house to another, we lose the previous house. We bring flowers inside and put them in a bowl in the room, and we watch them die. We give a dinner party. We have a wonderful time. Later in the evening, the dinner party is over. That wonderful time could not continue. And we can say to ourselves, what a lovely time we had at dinner. But the message underneath it is, we are no longer at that dinner. We are no longer having that wonderful time. The wonderful time has passed. It doesn't mean that we're unhappy. Sometimes we are. It just means that something is over. And we live lives in which things are over again and again and again. It's inescapable.
Having done new translations in Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, how have those translations influenced you?
Avere conosciuto nella traduzione molte lingue ha cambiato qualcosa nella tua poesia oppure no? È rimasta autonoma?
No, I don't think, first of all, I want to, because this is Italy, the two translations I've done from Italian are terrible, because I don't really know Italian well enough. I translated Canto 3 of the Divine Comedy, the Inferno, and it's the worst translation that exists. But I did translate Paura della Notte from a fragment of Frammento di Leopardi, and that was pretty good. But other than that, I mean, you know, when I was translating, when I translated Alberti from Spanish or Carlos Drummond from Portuguese, I was much younger. And I was trying to improve my own poetry, and I thought an apprenticeship as a translator would help. So that's essentially why I did it. I didn't learn much. I learned, because I spent most of I didn't really know Portuguese well enough. Somebody had to correct. I would show my translations to somebody who really knew the language, and even in Spanish, I did that. But what I did get from translating Spanish was a large vocabulary in Spanish. Now I have a girlfriend who is Spanish, and we speak Spanish, and I make mistakes grammatically, but my vocabulary is surprisingly large. So that's what I learned.
In reference to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, a poem that for many is very hard to read, that many have spent years studying, in contrast, much of your poetry is more autonomous, is more comprehensible. Can you talk a little bit about the difference in genre between, for example, your poetry and that of T.S. Eliot, and the differences between poetry that's very hard to comprehend in poetry?
Well, I would say...
Aspetta.
No, sorry.
Uno che si chiama Eliot scrive La terra desolata e diventa un capolavoro della poesia mondiale di tutti i tempi. The Westland non è proprio facile da leggere, no? Perché è un poema che comunque richiede una dose di conoscenza profonda della poesia, ancora oggi. Perché la poesia di Eliot è allusiva. Ho detto? Ah, West. Sì, sì. Sì, ok, grazie. Sì, sì. Sorry, ho sbagliato a dire West, ho detto...
Okay, Wasteland, yeah.
Westland. Uno scrittore che si chiama Eliot ha scritto La terra desolata, un'opera difficile da comprendere ancora oggi per chi non conosce davvero la poesia. Ecco, la scrittura di Eliot è allusiva. Tu, che hai letto Eliot, scrivi una poesia più autonoma, più comprensibile. Dovendo fare un confronto, qual è la poesia che proprio non si deve scrivere oggi?
Well, first of all, aside from all other considerations, The Wasteland is a poem of much greater magnitude than any poem I've written, largely because it exists as a cultural artifact. And my poems exist more or less as personal artifacts. I am not speaking for what's happened to Western culture, Western civilization. I'm only speaking about what I'm doing here on Earth. And that's all I'm capable of speaking for. The difficulties of a lot of poetry, Eliot's Wasteland, Pound's cantos, other poems, provide professors of English with a great deal of work. It's an industry. But, I mean, that's a joke, really. I believe in communicating more or less directly. I believe in
Se li possiamo riprendere la risposta dall'inizio.
okay.
Sorry. Fabrizio, vieni, non è un... Va bene.
Sono usciti, credo.
Sì, sì, ma non si sentiva molto, credo, no? Un po' sì. Ok.
Okay,
Prosegui da dove eri, non ti preoccupare. Prosegui. Io-
I can continue.
Sì, sì.
Yeah. I think that I write simply, and I mean, I don't necessarily intend to communicate immediately, but I want to seduce the reader in such a way as to have him or her pay attention. And I think the easiest way to do that is to speak in a language that they're familiar with, where they don't have to look up words, and where the disruptive, where they say the collage effect of the wasteland, where I use, instead of sort of pasting one thing, one event next to another, or splicing events, I will write write about a continuous event, which is in fact simply an image in time. And it's very easy to follow. I don't want my reader to feel that he has to understand my poem right away. I want the reader to be able to respond to the poem and then think, well, what does it really mean, afterward? But I want him to be, or her to be, seduced by the sound of the poem, the language of the poem, etc. Something like that.
On page 89 of Oscar Mondadori, you said, "Everything dims. The future is not what it was before." What did you mean by this?
In una poesia contenuta nell'Oscar Mondadori, tu dici tutto si offusca, il futuro non è più quello di una volta. Cosa vuol dire che il futuro non è più quello di una volta?
Well, like everything else, the future changes. What we aspired to 100 years ago isn't necessarily what we aspire to today, because we know, because the possibilities for the future change over time. I mean, in a more intimate sense, the future doesn't change. We want another day and another day, unless we're in deep pain or experiencing horrible sorrow. But by and large, each age invents its own future, as each age invents its own past.
Allora, in teoria questa prima parte è finita. Ora, se tu vuoi fare dei...
I think your questions are excellent, but very difficult to answer.
Mi fa ridere.
Very difficult. I hope I answered them okay. We'll see.
Dopo dobbiamo disegnare, Avevi solo 4 anni quando ti sei trasferito con la famiglia negli Stati Uniti, quel bambino piccolino, cosa faceva, cosa pensava?
I don't ho dimenticato quasi tutto.
Tutto hai dimenticato.
Quasi tutto.
Non ti ricordi com'eri carino, dove correvi, dove fuggivi, chi ti veniva a prendere?
No. Ricordo una volta quando fui a scuola, era Halloween.
Halloween, sì.
Halloween. Tutti
Mascherati.
studenti, sì. Io era vestito come un soldato.
Oh, un soldato.
Yeah.
Soldier.
And I was the only one dressed as a soldier. I felt ridiculous. I wanted to be a rabbit, or I wanted to be, something else, but I felt a little out of place. But it could be that it was just my language that was a problem. I don't remember, but I don't remember much.
Oh, no.
Because I was miserable, because, here I came to the United States speaking French and no English, and everybody's speaking English, and I didn't belong, and I felt miserable. So I don't remember.
You don't remember
No.
the question?
I remember waiting, as I told you.